18. Such categories as heat, fluidity, motion, solidity, etc. are discriminated by the ignorant. Such are concatenations. They cannot be designated as categories, hence they have no self-substance. No birth, transcendental truth, and eternity unthinkable. We know that there are two positions usually taken up by the Mahayana thinker who attacks problems of ontology. Unless we know which of the two positions is being upheld by him at the moment, we shall find him quite frequently contradicting himself. The one is that of conventionalism, and the other, if we put it so, is a highly metaphysical one. If we designate the first as a relative position, we may call the latter the absolute one. From the relative or conventional point of view, the Mahayana admits that there is causation and the world moves on from one state to another in conformity with the law. But it refuses to give this continuance an absolute value, for it is real only as far as our senses are concerned. Conventionalism or naive realism does not after all give real satisfaction to the deeper demands of the religious consciousness. So the Buddhists ask us to go beyond this world of appearance where supposedly all births and deaths are objectively real. A realm beyond the senses, however, must be opened from within ourselves. When we pursue our objective course, they would say, we come to no end, one chain leads to another, the concatenation has no beginning and no conclusion. We now make a retreat and dig deeper and deeper down into the very foundation rock of consciousness. When we do this, as the Lankavatara says, there finally takes place a revulsion apparently within our own minds. There opens up a new vista where we never expected anything religiously or spiritually convincing. In the beginning we supposed that we could not get down deep enough to come in touch with anything transcendental. But the new experience now inspires us with a conviction hitherto altogether unknown. This is the new position, super-sensual and absolute. This is the supreme wisdom, the realization of which within ourselves is so emphatically reiterated in the Sutra. And it is from this point of view that the world is now describable as unborn, with no self-substance, and unconditionally empty and not at all limited by causation. Birthlessness or emptiness does not belong to the domain of our relative consciousness. The Sutra in this respect is quite explicit lest the unwary should slip at this point. The development and definite assertion later in the Madhyamika school of the conception of twofold truth, samvriti and paramartha, or worldly and transcendental, is the natural consequence of the positions taken up by the Lankavatara. In order to show, though somewhat over-repeatedly, that the birthlessness of all things refers to a world not filled with sense data, I quote the following. Again, O Mahamati, it is taught by the Tathagatas of the past, future, and present that all things are unborn. Why? All things are unborn because they are the manifestations of our own mind and have no reality of their own, of which one can say that they are existent or non-existent, or that they are born. O Mahamati, all things are like the horns of a hare or a horse or an ass or a camel. As they are discriminated erroneously owing to the wrong judgments that are cherished by the ignorant and conference used, they seem to exist but in fact they are unborn. That all things are never born in their nature, this is realized only by supreme wisdom deeply buried in the inner part of consciousness, and is not to be grasped by the discriminative and dualistic intelligence of the ignorant and conference used. The realms of supreme wisdom and relative knowledge are not on the same plane. The world in which our bodies are nourished, works of utility are carried on, and where we have our habitation, this world so characterized rises from the alaya vijayftana when the latter divides itself into that which is grasped and that which grasps, whereby the ignorant are attached to the dualistic view of things, thinking that there is birth, abiding, and final passing away, and further they imagine that there really is the birth of all things to be subsumed under the categories of being and non-being. Therefore, O Mahamati, in this thou hast to discipline thyself assiduously. The reference to the hare, horns requires some explanation. As our common sense experience tells us, the hare has no horns, and this supplies one of the well-known analogies or illustrations for the Indian philosophers and logicians to their reasoning on non-existence and emptiness. Thus the Lankavatara makes frequent allusions to this illustration when the discourse turns on the problem of no birth and other kindred subjects. What the Sutra contends about this is that the doctrine of no birth must not be understood in the same sense as the absence of horns on a hare's head. In the latter case, the absence belongs to the field of relative knowledge. While the no birth is one of the utterances directly issuing from the highest religious experience in the Buddha's life, and it naturally transcends a world of mere sense data. That the hare has no horns gains its meaning when it is contrasted with a cow which is adorned with a pair of horns. Therefore, this kind of non-existence or birthlessness is a relative one, and no analogy exists between it and the Buddhist doctrine of no birth. There is another sense in which this analogy fails to illustrate the no birth. For the notion that the cow has horns is a product of elusive discrimination, as such horns have no reality like other objects in this world of particulars. When that with which a thing is contrasted no more exists, the contrast itself loses its sense. There is still another aspect to this analogy which makes it irrelevant to the proper comprehension of the Buddhist doctrine of no birth. That is to say, when the hare alone is considered in its absolute aspect, with no reference whatever to anything outside, we cannot make any statement whether affirmative or negative as to its horns. This is what the Lankavatara Sutra means when it says that the absolute truth transcends the relative categories of being and non-being, as in the case of the hare's horns. Not only the absence of horns on the hare is a relative assertion, but the idea itself is a result of discrimination. When the hare alone all by itself with no reference to anything is set before us, what argument, what inference, what relationship, and what discourse can we advance on it? Here is, indeed, the birthlessness of all things as maintained by the Mahayanists. When this idea of no birth or birthlessness is expressed in a more positive form, it is eternity unthinkable. The truth being above the category of causation and not subject to birth and disappearance. It has no other way to be described but as eternity, and as this eternity is an absolute one and not contrasted to impermanence or transiency, it may most fittingly be qualified as unthinkable. So we have here the nityam-acintyam, as the realm of supreme wisdom realized in one's innermost consciousness, as of the ultimate signification stamped with the seal of suchness. In what sense this is will be shown in the following pages. Mahamati wants to know what difference there is between the Buddha's own view of what is unthinkably eternal, and that of the philosophers who also talk about the makers or creative agents being such. To this the Buddha answers, what is so regarded by the philosophers cannot be established as such because their idea of a cause is not sufficient, because their causa has no reason in itself to be established as eternal. What is considered by them as eternal is in its nature something not eternal. Their view is based upon an irrelevant analogy. For their eternity is contrasted to things not eternal, that is, transient things of a relative world. Their eternity is a conditioned one, and not the unthinkable or transcendental. Theirs has no value of reality. It is like the hare's horns. It is only talked about. It exists in our language, it is true, but with no corresponding reality. The philosophers fail to comprehend the meaning of svahachulakshaja, by which the Buddha makes his assertion about eternity unthinkable. This is a state realized by all the Tathagatas in their inmost consciousness and aimed at by all the bodhisattvas as the finality of a life of the usual discipline. Depending on this experience, which is not conditioned by the logical categories of being and non-being, but which is a self-realization requiring no external proofs. The Buddha's position is unassailable. It is quite unlike the philosopher's conception of a maker. It is something unmade and unmaking, we may say something unborn, it is like space, nirvana, and nirodha, and therefore it can most becomingly be designated as eternity unthinkable. This something, eternity unthinkable, is also known as the truth such as it is, or supreme wisdom realized in the inmost consciousness of the Tathagatas. Nityam-acintyam Tathagathanali pratyat maryajnanadhigama tathata. The unborn has a positive connotation which is comprehensible through an experience only. But as our everyday life is so encumbered and warped by moral and intellectual prejudices, the Lankavatara makes desperate attempts to relieve us of this fatal inconvenience. Hence its untiring reiteration concerning the significance of transcending every form of dualism, and this by experience and not by intellectualism. Why? Because the latter is another name for discrimination, and discrimination is the builder of a world of particulars. As long as a man is thus in fetters, there is no hope of liberation for him. The positive conception in no birth. Why are all things unborn? Because they are unpredicable as made or making, because they have no creator. Why have they no self-substance? Because when they are reviewed with the interior intelligence, the categories such as individuality and generality are inapplicable to them. Why are all things neither departing nor coming? Because though they are characterized with the marks of individuality and generality, these marks, coming and departing, neither come nor depart. Why do all things never cease to exist? Because their not having self-substance makes it impossible to take hold of them. Why are all things impermanent? Because as soon as they take forms or appear with individualized marks they assume the nature of impermanence. Why are all things permanent? Because though they take forms or appear with individualized marks, they take really no such forms, and in reality there is nothing born, nothing passing away. When it is declared that there is no birth of anything, that all is empty and has no self-substance, we are apt to come to an erroneous conclusion, which is this. If this be the case, what is the use of our disciplining ourselves for the cleansing of defiling passions and the realization of supreme wisdom? One is not all a dream, a magically created phenomenon, with no reality underneath. For this way of reasoning, Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, has been censured. But as we have stated over and over again, those who take this view are still under the bondage of wrong judgments and discriminations. The main thesis of the Lankavatara, aside from its practical message of self-realization, may be said to dispel this form of erroneous inference. Therefore, announces the Buddha, the doctrine of non-existence is, in fact, a means by which the ignorant rid themselves of erroneous imagination and discrimination. And when they are ridded of these and get into the society of the wise, they would realize that there is indeed something really subsisting and endowed with self-substance. The eye that sees into the truth is an eye of wisdom. This something unborn and now so positively asserted is tathata, suchness, as was above referred to, but tathata has still an intellective odor. If it is preferred here as one with an ontological connotation, by which I mean the expression, ayajnana svabhava vastu, or aya vastu svabhava. Vastu generally means, a really existing thing, or, asene of a thing. But in Buddhism it quite frequently denotes an individual object in the world of individuals and is not necessarily understood in a metaphysical sense. This is especially important because Buddhism, being a form of idealism, does not itself take kindly to terms savoring of a realistic interpretation of existence. Whatever this is, the existence of a vastu is affirmed by the Lankavatara, whose self-substance is supreme wisdom as residing in the depths of our consciousness. Vastu is generally rendered as in the Chinese texts, and this is what the Sung has here. But the way adopts meaning, original being, or existence, and the ang to, mysterious thing. In the translation of the following Gatha, manifestly showing that Vastu has here a special connotation, being and non-being, between these two limits the mind moves. With the disappearance of this field the mind properly ceases to operate. when an objective world is no more grasped. There is neither disappearance nor non-being, as all these belong to a realm of relativity, except something absolute known as suchness, which realm belongs to the wise. Viewing the world from this point of view, i.e., from the point of eternal suchness, unthinkable and unattainable, it is quiet and unborn, cannot be characterized either as being or as non-being, it is above coming and going. And in this sense it is empty, like the hare's horns, like a dream, like the barren woman's child, and like magical creations. From the idealistic understanding of existence, there is mind itself, which when asserted divides itself into subject and object, and therefrom issues an eternal concatenation of causal chains. The philosophers take these transformations for reality and cling to them with egotistical motives and evil designs. 9 transformations are recognized by the philosophers, as regards form, appearance, cause, combination, opinion, birth, existence, manifested condition, and manifested work. Whatever one may say about the phenomenal world given to our senses, the Lankavatara insists that all things are unborn because they are found so and for no other reason. Here we return to the position from which we made our start, that is, that all the metaphysical and epistemological statements made in this sutra are finally resolvable into self-realization. 3. The triple body of the Buddha. The doctrine outlined, the dogma of the triple body, is now accepted by all Mahayana schools of Buddhism in China and Japan, is a late development in the history of Mahayana. The dogma, before it was fully formulated, was only adumbrated here and there in the earlier Mahayana sutras. It was probably not until the Yogacara philosophy began to be crystallized into a system by Asanga and his predecessors that the conception of the triple body came to form a part of their program. According to the Yogacara philosophy, the triple body is Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmalakaya. Dharma here may be understood in either way as reality, or as law-giving principle, or simply as law. Kaya means body, or system. The combination Dharmakaya is then literally a body or person that exists as principle. And it has now come to mean the highest reality from which all things derive their being and lawfulness, but which in itself transcends all limiting conditions. But Dharmakaya is not a mere philosophical word, as is indicated by the term Kaya, which suggests the idea of personality, especially as it relates to Buddhahood. It belongs to the Buddha, it is what inwardly and essentially constitutes Buddhahood, for without it a Buddha loses altogether his being. We may regard the Dharmakaya as corresponding to the Christian idea of Godhead. The Dharmakaya is also known as Svabhavakaya, meaning self-nature body. For it abides in itself, it remains as such, retaining its self-nature. It is in this sense the absolute aspect of the Buddha, in whom perfect tranquility prevails. The second body is the Sambhogakaya, which is ordinarily translated as body of recompense, or enjoyment.